What would you do if your own children threw you out like yesterday's trash? At 78 years old, Margaret Sullivan found herself homeless, abandoned by the very people she'd sacrificed everything for. But when she returned to her long-abandoned childhood home, what she discovered hidden inside those crumbling walls didn't just change her life. It exposed a family secret that had been buried for over 6 decades. This is a story about betrayal, resilience, and a discovery so shocking that it made national headlines. Stay until the end, because what Margaret found will leave you absolutely speechless. Margaret Sullivan had been a devoted mother for over 50 years. She raised 3 children, David, Patricia, and Jennifer, as a single mother after her husband passed away when the kids were still young. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to make sure they had everything they needed. She paid for their college educations by selling her own mother's jewelry. She helped with down payments on their first homes. She babysat her grandchildren every weekend without complaint. But apparently, none of that mattered. It started when Margaret suffered a minor stroke at age 77. Nothing catastrophic. Her doctors said she'd recover fully with some physical therapy. But her children saw an opportunity. Within weeks, they had convinced her to sign over power of attorney, claiming they just wanted to help manage her affairs during recovery. That's when everything changed. David, her eldest, immediately moved to sell her house, the home she'd lived in for 40 years. When Margaret protested, Patricia told her she was too old to live alone and that they were doing this for her own good. Jennifer, the youngest, simply stopped returning her calls. The house sold within a month. Margaret expected to move in with one of her children, or at least into a nice assisted living facility. "Where's the rest of the money?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. David didn't even look her in the eye. "Legal fees, repairs, agent commissions. This is what's left. You should be grateful." 3 weeks later, Margaret was standing on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases, watching strangers move into her home. Her children had stopped answering her calls completely. If this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We share real stories about real people that need to be heard. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. For 2 months, Margaret lived in a women's shelter. At 78 years old, surrounded by women half her age facing their own battles, she felt like she had disappeared from the world. Her children had taken everything, her home, her savings, and her dignity. But Margaret wasn't ready to give up. She remembered the house where she grew up, a small 2-story Victorian on Maple Street that had been in her family for 3 generations. Her father had built additions to it himself. Her mother had planted rose gardens that won neighborhood competitions. Margaret hadn't been back since her parents passed away 30 years ago. The house had been locked up, preserved in some legal limbo due to complex estate issues that were never fully resolved. With nowhere else to go, Margaret took a bus across 2 states to the small town where she'd grown up. She still had the old key her mother had given her decades ago, worn and rusty, hanging on a chain around her neck. When she arrived at Maple Street, her heart sank. The house looked like something from a horror movie. The porch was sagging, windows were broken, and ivy had consumed entire walls. The neighbors had clearly written it off as an abandoned eyesore, but it was hers, or at least it had been her family's. Margaret pushed open the front door, it wasn't even locked anymore, and stepped inside. The smell of mold and decay hit her immediately. Wallpaper hung in strips from the walls, floorboards were rotted through in places, birds had nested in the corners. But beneath the decay, she recognized home. There was the fireplace where her father used to read the newspaper. There was the kitchen window where her mother used to watch her play in the backyard. Margaret made a decision right then and there. She would stay, she would rebuild, and she would never again depend on anyone who could betray her. Margaret spent her first week just making the house livable. She cleared out debris, patched broken windows with cardboard and tape, and set up a sleeping area in the one room that wasn't completely destroyed. Her old childhood bedroom. She had no money for major repairs, so she did what she could with her own hands. One afternoon, she was working in the dining room, pulling down sections of water-damaged wallpaper to assess the walls underneath. That's when she noticed something odd. Behind a particularly stubborn section of wallpaper, the plaster seemed different, newer, smoother, deliberately patched. Margaret grabbed a butter knife and gently prodded at the plaster. It crumbled easily, revealing a hollow space behind it. Her heart racing, Margaret carefully removed more of the plaster. And then she saw it. A metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, wedged into a cavity in the wall. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. The box was heavy and covered in decades of dust. There was no lock, just a simple clasp. Margaret sat down on the dusty floor and opened it. Inside were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, old photographs, and beneath them, stacks of documents. Margaret began reading, and with each page, her eyes grew wider. These were property deeds, stock certificates, bank statements, all in her grandmother's name, her mother's mother, who had died when Margaret was just 10 years old. But it was the letter on top that made Margaret's hands shake. Written in her grandmother's elegant script, dated 1962, it read, "To my dearest Margaret, should you find this, and I pray someday you do, know that I never forgot you. Your mother refused my help out of stubborn pride, but I wanted you to have security. These properties and investments are yours. I've hidden them here because your mother would never accept them. But perhaps when you're older, when this house is yours, you'll discover what I've left for you. Build a good life, sweet girl. You deserve every happiness." Margaret couldn't believe what she was reading. She spread out the documents on the floor. There were deeds to 3 properties in the town, including a commercial building on Main Street that had been generating rental income for decades. There were stock certificates from companies that had split and grown exponentially over 60 years. There were bank account numbers and safety deposit box keys. Her grandmother had left her a fortune, hidden in a wall, waiting to be discovered. This story is about to get even more incredible. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the ending. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. Margaret immediately contacted a lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah Chen, who agreed to take the case after hearing Margaret's story. What Sarah discovered during her investigation was staggering. The 3 properties Margaret's grandmother had purchased in the 1950s were now worth over $2.8 million combined. The stocks had split multiple times and were now worth approximately $3.4 million. In total, Margaret's inheritance was worth over $6 million. Margaret's children had power of attorney over her affairs. Technically, they could claim they were acting in her best interest and try to take control of this newfound wealth too. Sarah worked quickly. She filed for an emergency hearing, arguing that Margaret's power of attorney should be revoked due to elder abuse and financial exploitation. She brought evidence of the house sale, the missing funds, and testimonies from the shelter where Margaret had lived. Margaret's children were ordered to appear in court. When they received the summons, they suddenly started calling their mother again, leaving voicemail after voicemail claiming they'd made mistakes and wanted to make things right. Margaret didn't return a single call. At the hearing, the judge listened to both sides. David claimed they'd sold the house to protect their mother's assets. Patricia insisted they'd planned to use the money for Margaret's care. Jennifer cried and said it had all been a terrible misunderstanding. Then Sarah presented bank statements showing that the money from Margaret's house sale had been divided among the 3 children and used for vacations, car purchases, and home renovations. Not a single penny had been set aside for Margaret's care. The judge's decision was swift and severe. The power of attorney was revoked immediately. Furthermore, the judge ordered Margaret's children to return every penny they'd taken from the house sale, plus interest, and awarded Margaret additional damages for emotional distress. Today, Margaret Sullivan is 80 years old and thriving. She fully restored her childhood home, not just repaired it, but transformed it into a beautiful Victorian masterpiece, with the help of local contractors who were moved by her story. The rose gardens are blooming again, just like when her mother tended them. But Margaret didn't stop there. She used her inheritance to establish something extraordinary. The Sullivan House, a transitional home for elderly women who've been abandoned or abused by their families. It provides free housing, legal assistance, counseling, and job training for women over 60 who have nowhere else to go. "I lived in that shelter," Margaret says. I saw women my age who had given everything to their families, only to be discarded. I never want another grandmother to sleep on a shelter cot and wonder if she matters. The Sullivan House has helped over 100 women restart their lives in just 2 years. Margaret runs it personally, greeting every new resident with a hug and a promise. You matter. Your life isn't over, and you will never be alone again. As for her children, Margaret hasn't spoken to them since the court case ended. They've attempted to reach out multiple times, but Margaret's lawyer has made it clear that any contact will be considered harassment. In her will, recently updated and ironclad, Margaret has left everything to the Sullivan House Foundation and various charities. Her children receive nothing. They made their choice, Margaret says simply. Now I've made mine. Margaret's story reminds us that it's never too late to start over, and that sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of something extraordinary. What her grandmother hid in that wall wasn't just money, it was hope. Preserved for decades, waiting for the moment Margaret would need it most. If Margaret's story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about resilience and hope. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. Would you have forgiven your children, or would you have done what Margaret did? Thank you for watching, and remember, your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you rise after they've knocked you down.